The eruption, stagecraft, rage, and the failed show of force. The hearing room did not feel like a venue for oversight, it felt like a pressure cooker. Air conditioning struggled, fluorescent lights buzzed, and the mahogany tables were crowded with microphones, nameplates, and water glasses set too near the edges. The gallery was packed to the rafters, local activists from South Los Angeles, veteran staffers who'd seen 100 such confrontations, and a younger cohort with phones already recording, angling for the shot that would travel across timelines before the gavel even cooled. Everyone understands the choreography now. Congressional ritual as content pipeline. You can sense when a hearing has been designed for the clip, not the record. Representative Maxine Waters entered in the key of confrontation. The script's first beat is kinetic, a fist cracking against the table. Papers lift off, glasses toppling, a small tide of water running toward the microphones. She deployed a line meant to sting and headline in the same breath, a loaded epithet aimed across the dais at Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, while the chair pleaded for decorum that would not come. The crowd rewarded volume with volume, a chant rose. A chorus of, "Tell him, Maxine," carried by those who had come expecting a demolition of another conservative foil. It is the oldest stagecraft in Washington, moral theater framed as oversight. If the opening belonged to Waters, the shot composition belonged to Kennedy. He sat still, dabbed his papers dry, wiped his splattered glasses with the unhurried care of a man who believes time favors procedure. The contrast was deliberate and devastating, motion versus stillness, anger versus courtesy, heat versus the deceptively powerful cool of someone prepared to outlast. In political combat, optics are not accessory, they are argument. By the time he asked, in a voice as soft as it was cutting, "Are you finished, Congresswoman?" the audience understood the pivot. Performative righteousness had given him a free opening to redefine the day. Waters wasn't finished, at least. Not in the way she intended. She escalated, widening the indictment to biography and region, invoking the South and its ugliest ghosts as if they were seated in the witness chair. Her supporters surged again. Staffers on her side edged their chairs back a few inches. That subtle choreography, the quiet slide away from the blast radius, is an old Washington tell. Allies who smell a coming reversal begin to study their phones or the ceiling. They don't cross the aisle, they create space. The ambient tension shifted from triumphant to precarious. Kennedy chose this moment to reach into a manila folder with a label visible to every lens. The prop was not accidental, it said, "Banking Ethics," in bold type. The kind of on-screen lower third you would want pre-baked for cable news. He held up an 8x10 photograph of One United Bank's headquarters in Los Angeles. Once celebrated as a cornerstone of black-owned banking, the room's decibel level dropped a register. The senator did not raise his voice, he didn't need to. He asked a question that was not rhetorical. Could they discuss the bank in Waters's community and the $350 stake held by her husband? Silence is rare in a hearing room. This one arrived like a power outage. You could hear the fluorescent buzz again. The camera operators adjusted their zoom. Security, who had moved forward during the table slamming, eased back a half step. Waters's finger, still extended from her last jab, trembled almost imperceptibly. She warned him off, "Don't you dare," and half rose as if to seize the papers. But the sergeant-at-arms and committee staff moved with the well-practiced choreography of fire marshals closing a door before smoke can spread. Here, the genre changes. We move from spectacle to docket. Kennedy lays out a timeline the way auditors do: date, decision, consequence. September 2008, the financial system convulses. One United's capital position implodes alongside the government seizure of mortgage giants. The senator's pointer circles red flags on a projected slide. Concentrated GSE exposure. Capital impairment. Urgent need for federal assistance. The next slide lands harder. A call log bearing Waters's name. Placed to the Treasury Secretary. The following slide tightens the aperture. A meeting she frames as for the National Bankers Association, except the attendance. He says, shows only One United executives, not a caucus of minority banks seeking generalized relief. A bespoke consult for the one institution in which her household had a six-figure stake. Waters tries to move the battle back to the terrain of identity and history. Charges of racist attack. Of a Southern senator presuming to lecture a black woman about ethics. Kennedy's reply is courteous and lethal. Strength, he says, is not in dispute, corruption is colorblind. In a committee long accustomed to the protection of symbolic armor, his point lands because it shifts the frame from who is speaking to what the documents show. The energy that applause once fed now dissipates. Even those who arrived to cheer begin to lean forward to read the slides. There is nothing more politically dangerous than asking the public to examine a receipt. The committee chair reins the room in with the authority of rules rather than rhetoric. He reminds everyone that materials were submitted 48 hours earlier, that Waters's office had been notified. The insistence on process is not merely bureaucratic throat-clearing, it's a signal of legitimate grounds. When the chair chooses procedure over partisanship in the moment of heat, the room takes notice. A hearing that began as partisan theater now feels uncomfortably like a preliminary hearing, same architecture. Different stakes. From an analytical lens, the sequence illustrates a recurring pattern in congressional spectacle. Stage-managed outrage can command the instant, but documentation governs the hour. Waters ruptured the decorum intentionally, to frame Kennedy as antagonist and herself as righteous antagonist of a villain. But the second the evidentiary rhythm begins, slides, logs, attendance sheets, the hearing's logic obeys a different gravity. The senator's measured cadence becomes an instrument. He is not trying to break the news, he is trying to build the record. Expectation of viral moment gives way to audit momentum. Notice the optics around the periphery. Democratic members rediscovering urgent email. A junior member slipping quietly out a side door. Staff counsel passing the chair a note that is read and folded with a small, resigned nod. None of these gestures are dispositive, but each is a meteorological sign. A caucus can defend a colleague through noise, it rarely defends through paper. The stronger the paper, the fewer the defenders willing to be in the shot. By the time Kennedy arrives at the sentence that recalibrates the stakes, "Shall we talk about how your husband made $350 from this bank?" The gallery's tone has changed from celebratory to clinical. The senator does not accuse, he narrates. He contrasts institutions that failed without bespoke intervention with the one that survived after a targeted meeting. He pairs that with the value of stock that did not go to zero. The insinuation is structural, not merely personal. Public power, private benefit. It is the elemental formula of conflict of interest, expressed not as law school hypothetical but as hometown bank, balance sheet, and family portfolio. Waters, never one to shrink from a fight, doubles down. She warns, she lunges, she frames, she tries to pull the contest back to where she wins, the precinct of identity, grievance, and the moral memory of struggle. But that isn't where the committee is anymore. Even her allies can see it. The chair's gavel acquires a new timbre, not scolding, but shepherding a proceeding that has moved from political theater into something closer to evidentiary hearing. The cameras, too, shift. They capture not just the orator but the screen behind the orator. The timelines, the captions in unforgiving sans serif. $350 stake. Meeting arranged. Attendance. One united only. What is striking, if you are watching closely, is how quickly a room can unmake a reputation once the rhythm changes. Waters has traded on ferocity for decades, it has often served her well. But ferocity is a solvent in the wrong container. Against documentary pacing, it drips down the sides of the beaker and leaves a stain. Anger that once felt like armor begins to read as avoidance. The same crowd that arrived to chant senses it too. And the chant winds down to a murmur, not betrayal. Not yet, but a recalibration. Passion, they are reminded, is not a proof. The final beat of this opening act is not a line but a tableau. Waters gripping the table's edge. A staffer whispering an urgent message she waves away. A senator closing his folder only to open a thicker one. The chair's gavel tapping with the weary inevitability of process. The hearing intended as an indictment of a Southern conservative has become a referendum on a Californian power broker. More precisely, it has become a referendum on a theory of representation. Whether the choreography of outrage can outrun the arithmetic of ethics. That debate will not be settled by a viral clip. It will be settled the boring, devastating way, by dates, names, emails, bank statements, attendance lists, and the widening silence of colleagues who decide that loyalty to a person is not worth the risk to a party. In this part of the story, no verdict is rendered, only a frame, but the frame is enough to change the viewing. The audience has been asked to stop listening for applause lines and start reading footnotes. And in Washington, that shift, from sound to text, is often the beginning of the end. The first cut. One United Bank and the $350,000 question. The first moment of stillness in the committee room does not feel like peace. It feels like oxygen being pulled out of the air. Senator John Kennedy remains seated, steady as a metronome, while Maxine Waters vibrates with anger, her knuckles whitening around the table's edge. The photograph in Kennedy's hand, a simple 8x10 print of a bank building, is the scalpel that begins the operation. He sets it down carefully before her, his drawl low and deliberate. Since we're discussing ethics and community service, shall we talk about how your husband made $350,000 from this bank? The temperature of the room drops. The same gallery that had cheered her righteous fury moments earlier now leans forward in silence. Even the fluorescent hum seems louder. Waters opens her mouth to reply, but no sound comes out. She can feel the gravity of the question, because it isn't a metaphorical accusation. It's arithmetic. The bank that became a mirror. To understand why this moment lands with such force, one must recall the mythology surrounding One United Bank. Once hailed as a symbol of black economic empowerment, the institution had been touted by community leaders as proof that financial inclusion could coexist with capitalism. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, that narrative was suddenly at risk. Kennedy's presentation slices through that mythology with cold sequencing. Slide 1. The bank's balance sheets showing exposure to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac stocks, assets wiped out when the government intervened. Slide 2. A timeline of September 2008 phone calls. Red flags appear beside two dates, September 8 and 9. On the latter, Representative Maxine Waters called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson directly. Her defense is instantaneous and familiar. That was about protecting minority banks. Kennedy nods, almost sympathetically. Indeed, Congresswoman. Yet the attendance sheet from the meeting shows only executives from One United. No other minority banks were invited. Not one. The committee screens project attendance lists, each name tied to One United. No Carver Bank, no Broadway Federal, no United Bank of Philadelphia. Only the bank in which her husband's stock stood on the brink of collapse. Conflict of interest, not in theory, but in practice. What unfolds next is less about moral outrage and more about the slow strangulation of procedural hypocrisy. Kennedy reads directly from official memoranda, his tone unwavering. You represented to the Treasury that this was an industry-wide issue. Yet your staff scheduled the meeting for One United executives alone. You personally placed the call that arranged it. Treasury records note that you mentioned your husband's bank by name. Waters interrupts. That's a lie. Kennedy lifts the document without raising his voice. The memo is from the Treasury Department. Congresswoman, if it lies, it does so under the Great Seal of the United States. It is here that the performance aspect of politics collapses. Waters' allies, once eager for viral theatrics, are suddenly remembering how long the internet remembers. Staffers behind her avert their eyes. The chairman bangs the gavel, not in anger but in disbelief that the circus has turned courtroom so quickly. The contrast is brutal. Waters' voice, normally booming with unassailable conviction, begins to crack. This is another racist attack on a strong black woman who refuses to bow down. Kennedy replies without hesitation, his tone polite but surgical. Congresswoman, I have the highest respect for strong women, and for black women who fought to open doors in politics. My issue is not with your identity. My issue is with a potential misuse of public trust. Corruption, ma'am, has no color. It's green, the color of money. A ripple runs through the gallery, not applause. Not outrage, but the uneasy sound of shifting weight and clicking cameras. Receipts over rhetoric. The senator's PowerPoint continues, a slow-motion autopsy of how the bank's fortunes reversed after congressional intervention. The committee's projector now displays a damning headline. One United Bank receives $12 million in TARP funds. Kennedy's voice is calm. You lobbied under the pretense of saving minority banking institutions. But only one institution benefited. That institution saved your family's investment. A quiet gasp spreads through the room. Facts have no decibel level. Yet their sound is unmistakable. Waters reaches for her water glass and realizes, absurdly, that she spilled it in her earlier fury. The symbolism is cruel but poetic, which she knocked over in anger. She now thirsts for in desperation. The senator doesn't exploit the moment for theatrics. He simply lets the evidence breathe. I'm not here to discuss race, gender, or ideology, he says, turning another page. I'm here to ask whether federal intervention was influenced by private interest, and whether the American taxpayer unknowingly financed a family bailout. His language is simple, but its precision is lethal. It removes ideology and leaves arithmetic. How the crowd begins to turn. In every scandal's anatomy, there is a point when a crowd realizes it has misread the protagonist. That moment is visible now, tiny changes in body language. Supporters stop recording. One aide checks his watch for no reason. Another opens her phone and quietly disables live streaming. Waters sees it too. She knows these signals. She's watched them happen to others over the years, the subtle, silent migration of loyalty away from the accused. Point of order, she shouts, her voice trembling. The chairman replies flatly, there is no point of order during witness testimony. It's a bureaucratic sentence, but it lands like a judge's ruling. Kennedy, sensing the shift, doesn't gloat. He continues his cross-examination as if reading a weather report, precise, unemotional, unavoidable. Congresswoman, you said your husband's investments were his business. Yet financial disclosure laws exist precisely because your household's business is the public's concern. When you made that call to Treasury, his business became ours. The beginning of the narrative collapse. What's remarkable about this sequence is that Kennedy never once raises his voice. In political theater, silence can be more devastating than volume. He allows the paper trail to perform the indictment. Behind him, a slide changes again, no longer charts or emails, but photographs of other banks that failed, each accompanied by a red, closed, stamp, Carver Federal Savings, Broadway Federal, United Bank of Philadelphia. These institutions, he says quietly, served communities like yours, but they didn't have a congresswoman on the phone with the Treasury Secretary. Their depositors lost everything. In that instant, the moral arithmetic in the room reverses. What began as a rally for social justice now feels like an exposé of selective justice. Waters begins to speak, then stops. The anger that once projected dominance now reveals exhaustion. Her hand trembles again, not from indignation, but from the recognition that she is no longer dictating the tempo. The rhythm belongs to the documents. The room sits suspended between disbelief and inevitability. What everyone senses, but nobody says aloud, is that the hearing has ceased to be about one senator's questioning of one congresswoman. It has become a referendum on credibility itself, the fragility of moral authority when confronted with ledger lines and timestamps. Kennedy closes his folder, the gesture so understated it feels ceremonial. Congresswoman, he says evenly, that concludes my initial statement. But I do have a few more questions about family business, campaign funds, and ethics filings. It's a promise, not a threat, and in that calm tone lies the certainty that the next act will not be an argument, it will be an audit. Process and consequences, ethics reports, staff actions, and the grandson link. By the time Senator Kennedy reopened his folder, the hearing had transformed from a shouting match into something more forensic. The early adrenaline of political theater was gone. What remained was the slow, procedural rhythm of accountability, the rhythm Washington fears most. The ethics trail. Kennedy began the next phase with clinical precision. Congresswoman, you've often said you were cleared by the ethics committee. He began, his tone almost sympathetic. Let's examine what that really means. He reached into his folder and produced a report thick enough to stop a bullet. The House Ethics Committee's official findings from the One United investigation. The cover bore the date, July 2011. He flipped through pages marked with fluorescent tabs. The committee found. Kennedy read, That Representative Waters should have instructed her staff to refrain from assisting One United Bank in its pursuit of federal aid due to her financial conflict of interest. He looked up. Congresswoman, that language doesn't say innocent. It says should have known better. Waters's lips parted, but before she could respond, Kennedy continued, turning to a second section highlighted in yellow. Representative Waters's chief of staff, Mr. Mikhail Moore, continued to communicate with Treasury officials on behalf of One United despite the Congresswoman's stated recusal. He paused for effect. Your chief of staff, your grandson. A ripple went through the room. It wasn't outrage, it was recognition. Everyone in Washington knew what that word meant. Nepotism. The quiet currency of the capital. The grandson's role. Kennedy turned another page. The committee issued your grandson a formal letter of reproval. It said he knowingly acted in violation of ethical standards. He looked directly at Waters. He was 32, old enough to know better, but young enough to believe power made the rules optional. Waters's voice wavered as she tried to defend him. He was doing his job, he didn't understand the. Kennedy cut in, his politeness sharper than any gavel. Congresswoman, he was doing your job. You instructed him to handle matters you yourself could not touch because of your conflict. That's not delegation, that's insulation. He tapped the report once. Softly, like a judge punctuating a verdict. This letter of reproval was the Ethics Committee's way of saying what they couldn't, that you hid behind family to do what you could not do openly. In the gallery, journalists began typing again. They weren't writing headlines about racial double standards or partisan warfare anymore. They were cataloging facts, dates, amounts, signatures, relationships. The husband's exit. And then, almost theatrically, the door at the back of the chamber opened. An elderly man with a cane stepped out of the shadows, Sidney Williams. Waters's husband. The timing was cinematic, but his expression was not that of a man arriving to defend his wife. It was the look of someone walking away from a fire he could no longer control. Reporters noticed immediately. Cameras swiveled. Kennedy paused mid-sentence, watching as the man slowly made his way toward the exit. Waters froze, her anger faltering into something else entirely. Sidney, she called weakly. Wait. But he didn't. He walked past the rows of aides and activists, ignoring the shouts of, Mr. Williams, did you profit from the bailout? And, do you have any comment? He exited without a word. The image was devastating. The husband leaving while the wife faced the storm alone. The pattern of privilege. Kennedy turned back to his documents. His voice was quieter now, almost compassionate, which made the next revelation cut deeper. One United eventually received $12 million in TARP funds. He said, not the $50 million they wanted, but enough to survive. He pointed to the slide behind him. It now displayed a list of minority-owned banks that didn't make it. Broadway Federal Bank, failed, 2009. Carver Federal Savings, nearly failed, 2010. United Bank of Philadelphia, failed, 2011. These banks served the same communities you claim to represent. He continued, but they didn't have a congresswoman on speed dial at the Treasury. Waters gripped the table. I was helping all minority banks. Kennedy's reply was immediate and calm. Then why did only one attend your meeting? He clicked to the next slide, a Treasury memo titled, Meeting Summary, Congresswoman Waters. The text, projected 10 feet high, was impossible to ignore. Representative Waters specifically referenced One United Bank multiple times. No other institutions were discussed. It was bureaucratic language, but in Washington, bureaucracy can convict faster than passion. The turning of the room. The gallery, once packed with supporters chanting her name, had thinned. Some of the younger activists looked down, embarrassed. Others left quietly, unwilling to watch their hero dismantled line by line. The sound of the gavel was now a metronome of inevitability. Even Waters's fellow Democrats were shifting uneasily. One whispered to another, "This is bad." Another began scrolling through his phone, likely drafting a statement of concern, the Washington euphemism for abandonment. Waters tried again to reclaim the stage. "This is political theater. You're using my family to distract from your own party's corruption." But the chair's voice, tired but firm, silenced her. "Congresswoman, please refrain from deflecting. You will have time for rebuttal when the witness concludes. For the first time in decades, Maxine Waters was no longer the loudest voice in the room. The analytical lens. How power protects itself. Kennedy leaned back for a moment, letting the silence settle before adding the commentary that separated performance from analysis. What we're witnessing, he said evenly, is not a one-time lapse in judgment. It's a pattern, a culture where political power becomes a family business, where public service turns private profit, and accountability becomes optional. He gestured toward the ethics report again. The real tragedy isn't just corruption. It's the slow erosion of trust. Every constituent who believed in reform sees this and concludes that nothing changes, that every slogan hides a balance sheet. It was not just a closing argument. It was a sermon. The shift from defense to damage control. When Kennedy finally closed the folder, Waters looked diminished, not only physically but symbolically. Her hairline sheen of sweat reflected the overhead light, her breathing audible through the microphone. She wasn't just losing the argument, she was losing the narrative. Congresswoman, Kennedy said softly, you've spent decades fighting the powerful. But somewhere along the way, you became them. Waters didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was an answer in itself. The chairman cleared his throat. The committee will now move to review additional evidence concerning campaign finance and familial payments. Kennedy nodded. Understood, Mr. Chairman. I believe the next exhibit will clarify the pattern further. He tapped the folder labeled, Family Empire. The words hung in the air like a storm warning. The family empire, daughter, nephew, and the circle of money. When Kennedy reopened his folder labeled, Family Empire, the atmosphere in the hearing room changed once again. Gone was the bombast of political debate. What followed resembled the unveiling of a corporate crime board, names, connections, dollar figures, arrows looping from one pocket to another. The daughter and the slate mailer. Congresswoman, Kennedy began evenly. Your daughter, Karen Waters, has been compensated by your campaign committees for years, over $750,000. To be precise, can you explain what services justified that amount? Waters bristled. She runs the slate mailer operation, a legitimate business. Every campaign uses them. Kennedy nodded, acknowledging the point before twisting the knife. Yes. Except most campaigns don't have the candidate's daughter charging those fees. And those that do, usually end up in the ethics committee's archives. The projector flickered again, revealing a flowchart that could have been drawn from a money laundering case file. Candidates right-pointing arrow contributions right-pointing arrow citizens for Waters right-pointing arrow Karen Waters. Inc. right-pointing arrow slate mailers right-pointing arrow endorsements right-pointing arrow back to candidates. A perfect circle. Each time a candidate paid your campaign, Kennedy explained, your daughter's company was paid soon after. The result? You sold endorsements to those willing to pay, and your family took the cut. The gallery erupted, not in cheers, but in murmurs. Reporters leaned forward, photographers zoomed in. Waters slammed the table. You're twisting it. That's how politics works. Kennedy's voice did not rise. Then perhaps politics needs untwisting. The staff revolted. From the back of the room, a voice broke through the murmurs. I have something to say. All eyes turned to a young woman standing in the gallery, early 30s. Nervous but resolute. I worked for Congresswoman Waters' campaign for 2 years. She said, her voice trembling. Unpaid. We were told it was an opportunity, that we'd be part of history. While we ate ramen, her daughter got $40 a month. Waters pointed at her. You're lying. I don't even know who you are. The woman held up a phone. Its screen glowing with photos, selfies from campaign offices. Screenshots of emails signed, Karen Waters. Yes, you do. You called me sweetheart when you needed coffee. The crowd shifted again. Others began to rise, former volunteers. Ex-staffers, their voices overlapping. She's right. I worked 16-hour days. My mother donated to that campaign. My daughter did too, and we got nothing. The chairman's gavel thundered for order. But the sound barely contained the chaos. Kennedy waited patiently for silence to return. When it finally did, he said, the measure of public service isn't how loudly one speaks about justice. It's how quietly one treats those who serve under them. The family payroll. He clicked to the next slide. It showed a table of names, positions, and payments. Mikhail Moore, Chief of Staff, grandson, minus $174 per year. Karen Waters, consultant, daughter, minus $750 over 8 years. Edward Waters, consultant, son, minus $30. Nephew, administrative services, minus $25. Over 8 years. Kennedy summarized. More than $1 million flowed from your campaigns and associated committees to your relatives. All while your district's poverty rate increased and homelessness doubled. He looked up. Your slogan says, for the people. The record suggests, for the family. The words hung in the air, heavy as the silence that followed. The collapse of the narrative. Waters tried to reclaim control. This is a partisan witch hunt, she shouted. Republicans are terrified of strong women. But her voice broke mid-sentence. Rage could no longer mask fear. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his expression almost pitying. Congresswoman, the witch hunt ended when the receipts began. What we're seeing isn't persecution, it's prosecution by facts. He gestured toward the chairman. And we haven't even reached the FEC violations yet. The financial web. The next folder contained photocopies of Federal Election Commission, FEC, notices. Kennedy lifted one after another. Like a dealer laying out losing hands. Failure to properly disclose expenditures. 2005. Commingling of campaign and personal funds. 2007. Excessive contributions. 2009. Failure to disclose donors. 2011. Repeat violations. 2013. 2015. 2019. 2021. 2025. Each document hit the table with a soft thud that echoed louder than any insult. These are not rumors. They are findings, each one bearing your name. Waters lurched forward, attempting to grab the stack, but security intercepted her. In the struggle, several pages tore, a symbolic act of destruction captured perfectly by the cameras. Kennedy calmly pulled out duplicates. I have copies, Congresswoman, many copies. The press gallery erupted in camera flashes. The image would lead every evening broadcast, the Congresswoman clawing at evidence as if trying to erase it by hand. The betrayal within. Suddenly, a voice from the committee's Democratic side broke the tension. Mr. Chairman, said Representative David Kim of California. His tone strained. I have information relevant to this hearing. Waters' head snapped toward him. David, don't you dare. But he stood. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked his phone. She threatened me, he said. I have the texts. The projector displayed screenshots of messages. You're either with the Waters family or against us. Karen needs $50K for the Slate mailer, don't make me ask twice. Remember what happened to Martinez when he crossed me? Gasps rippled through the room. Kennedy asked gently, would you share those with the committee for the record? Kim nodded. Already did. It was the moment every scandal reaches, the turning of allies into witnesses. The silence afterward was the sound of a dynasty collapsing under its own weight. The moral coda. Kennedy closed his final folder. His tone now elegiac rather than prosecutorial. Congresswoman, you were given a sacred trust, to represent those without voice. To lift up communities long ignored. Instead, you used that trust as a family business. The tragedy isn't just yours. It's theirs, the people of South Los Angeles who believed you were their champion. He looked directly into the camera. Corruption wears many faces, sometimes righteous, sometimes revolutionary, but it always ends the same way, alone, surrounded by paperwork, betrayed by the very hands that once applauded you. He gathered his documents, sliding them neatly into his briefcase. The record will reflect the evidence presented. The Department of Justice has already received copies. The rest, Congresswoman, is history. Waters slumped into her chair. Motionless. The gavel fell with the hollow sound of finality. The aftermath. Outside the chamber, her staff fled down hallways already echoing with the word resignation. Social media exploded. #corrupt Waters trending globally within minutes. Former allies issued cautious statements of deep concern. The Congressional Black Caucus released one line that sealed her political fate. Public service demands integrity. No one is above accountability. By the end of the day, the woman once feared across Washington sat alone in her office, staring at the portrait of her younger self, the idealist who had marched for justice, now replaced by the image of an empire built on greed. As night fell, the sound of sirens outside her window seemed to echo the inevitable. The FBI agents would come soon. The briefcase full of evidence would become exhibits in court. And the chapter of Maxine Waters, revolutionary turned relic, would close with the quietest sound of all, the clicking of handcuffs.